Hello and welcome to Bliponomics. Phil is waiting for a tow truck tonight. I'm Jerry Anthony, and tonight we are talking all things the Blip. We think enough time has passed. We need to talk about it, and I want to hear from you. Please subscribe to Bliponomics wherever you're watching right now, or email if you want to be a part of the show, bliponomics@gmail.com. The Blip. That is a funny term for the most traumatic and devastating event in the history of the universe. I hate that name. I wish we could do better. It's not funny, Dimitri. The name is stupid. It should have been called the Annihilation or the Devastation. No, Dimitri. Okay. The Snap. The Snap is the event that caused the Blip. The Blip is the 5-year time span between the two snaps. Dusted or snapped or the vanished is what you were if you disappeared after the first snap. After the second snap, if you returned, you can now call yourself blipped, along with dusted or snapped or vanished. All those fancy terms for half of us. But what about the other half? Still no good name for those who remained, is there? Like, left behind is too Christian. The unblipped, the non-blipped, the non-dusted, the skipped. The skipped. I kind of like that. The blipped and the skipped. Anyway, let's talk about it. Who had it worse? The blipped or the skipped? They both suck, really. But it depends who you ask. You ask the one whose family vanished before their eyes, and then they mourned with the rest of the earth, eventually moving on to rebuild, 5 years of pain and loneliness, wondering why me, why not me, why them. Then to finally start to heal, start to move on, only to experience the reverse trauma of the return 5 years later. Or do you ask the person who is happily living with their family, sitting in the living room, and then in the blink of an eye, 5 years have passed. Your family has replaced you, and all your possessions are gone. You have no home. You don't recognize your family, and they don't recognize you. That is the story of a lot of people. Here's another question, and I have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to keep throwing them out there. Would you switch your fate? Surprisingly, most people would. Like, we looked at a poll, and about 80% of both the blipped and the skipped, if they asked if they could do it all over again, would switch their fate. Meaning if we had to do it all over again, the vanished would choose to stay, and the ones who stayed through the 5 years would rather be blipped and skip the whole damn thing. I thought that was fascinating. And speaking of doing it all over again, I have a message for the Avengers. A suggestion, really. I mean, I don't mean to be critical or seem ungrateful, but the next time you decide to undo the will of a god and repopulate half the universe, how about giving the rest of us little people a heads up? I mean, you solved time travel. You couldn't send a mass email or an Avenger alert, something like that saying, hey, this is Captain America. We're going to try some crazy shit. So if the people who died 5 years ago suddenly show up at your door, don't freak out. Okay, thank you for supporting your local Avengers. Something like that, I think, would have been great. It certainly would have prevented a lot of awkward and frankly traumatic situations. And I think some of us are ready to talk about those situations and how we are all trying to move forward together. The blipped and the skipped. I'm going to make that a thing, Dimitri. I like the skipped. But since the initial shock of returning, have you noticed like this weird rift, like this unspoken resentment between those that vanished and those that remained? I'm going to be honest, and this is my personal observation, and maybe I'm being a little paranoid, but I mean, those who remained kind of treat the blipped like we're assholes or something. Sometimes, like, for example, people only want to hang out with other blips, and the skips are hanging out with the skips, and they're like standing in the corner looking at us all suspicious, acting like old Vietnam vets sometimes, saying like, look at those blips, man. They don't know what it was like, man. They were there. type of thing. That's what it feels like. Do you see that happening in your circle? If so, let's talk about it. Another question for you. And we can title this question, Modern Problems Require Modern Solutions. Do you, like so many others, put your blip status on your social media profiles or your dating profiles? Is someone's blip status one of the first things you ask when you meet someone new? How about this? What do you do when your employer wants to know your blip status? Are you legally obliged to have to tell your employer your blip status? Later in the show, I'll read an email from someone in that very situation. We'll also hear a few stories from Reddit about what people did during the blip. One titled, "Am I the asshole for only wanting to date others that blipped?" Another titled, "I wish I never came back." That sounds fun. We'll hear from someone who thinks the blip wasn't random, and someone else who wants to reset the blip date to 0. We'll hear from them and maybe, hopefully, you when we come back. Welcome back to Bliponomics, and now we are going to hear from you. First email out the gate, Fred. I read this email and I thought this was the best idea. Fred writes, "We all know the world changed on that one single day when everyone returned. And yet, we're still using a calendar that's nearly 2,000 years old. Ridiculous. Here's my proposal. If we can set our years to the birth of Christ 2,000 years ago, why can't we set a new year based on the blip? The day the vanished returned should be our new January 1st, 000 AB, after blip. It's historic. I mean, the birth of Christ was great and all, but even Jesus didn't bring back half the universe. I mean, the birth of Christ was great and all. Think of how clean our dates would look. All those anniversaries, birthdays, wedding dates, they'd all line up again. Yes, they'd all line up again, and you never need to remember if something happened before or after the blip. I mean, we already reset to 0 with the birth of Christ, so it's not like society isn't flexible. If we can pivot on a guy's birthday, we can surely pivot on the day that brought back half the universe. It would honor the impact of both the blipped and the skipped and put us all on equal footing. So let's make 2024 into 4AB and give the world a fresh start. Who's with me? All the best, Fred. Fred, I love this idea. Let's do it. Who do we call to make it happen? Well, it would have to be more than our own elected officials. It would be something that we would need all the countries to agree on and execute. You know what? I think this is already too much to ask. Thank you, Fred. I love the idea. If this comes up, I will support it 100%. Thanks for the email. This comes from an anonymous emailer who brings up a very interesting question. My boss is demanding to know my blip status. He writes, a very long story short, I wasn't blipped. My family was, but I remained. I was alone, and I did some bad things to survive. Let's just leave it at that. After everyone returned, I went back to my old life. I got a new job, but on my resume, I left the 5 blip years blank. I was hired. It wasn't an issue. I figured they just assumed I blipped. I've actually heard a lot of people leaving the 5 blip years blank because, I think it's fair that everyone should, get a redo for those 5 years. He continues, 1 year later, it's apparently an issue because I refused to check a box on some form and my boss asked me directly, were you blipped? Yes or no? I refused to answer, said it was none of their business. Now he's giving me 24 hours to give him an answer or he's firing me for being deceptive on my resume. Am I legally required to disclose my blip status to my employer? That is a great question. I suppose they would know if you were alive, if you were using credit cards and stuff. But if you were blipped, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. So I thought this was a very good question, and I put this up to Reddit. subreddit Earth19999. And I got some pretty good answers. Ohio State Hack says, Blip status is technically a part of your medical record, so no, your boss has no right to that information. Kimber Crystal 1138 writes, I was about to say that I think Blip status is HIPAA protected. Ooh. Tell your listener to tell their employer that they legally do not have to disclose that. I think you might be right, Kyber Crystal. KingRat1 says, I've always treated it as another thing one has no tangible choice in, such as gender, race, or age. Discrimination is discrimination. It's not like he's asking if they committed felonies related to that business. I could kind of understand that, but about a basic life event change that no one could predict. They definitely need to get a lawyer or contact the EEOC or both. Good advice. I wonder if we have any lawyers. I would love to hear a lawyer chime in on this. Seven Rowell writes, frankly, the blip was a state of chaos that only rich people could possibly get through unscathed. Expecting an average person to keep building a career in that time is ridiculous. Yes, I absolutely agree. Those are all great responses. Thank you, Reddit. Thank you to my favorite sub, Earth19999. Here's another one I found on Reddit. This comes from a Bag of Smaller Bags. Am I the asshole for only wanting to date other people who blipped? My linear age is 25, but my actual age is 20 because I blipped. On all my dating apps, I put my birth year 5 years ahead of the actual. Still waiting on a blip checkbox so I don't have to. And I put in my bio only interested in other people who blipped. I've gotten a lot of nasty, rude messages from people saying that I'm discriminating against people who had to live through the blip. And I guess I am. But I feel valid about it for a lot of reasons. People who live through the blip tend to have more emotional baggage because they lived 5.5 years of apocalypse. 100% true. This is not their fault, but it's also 100% true. In my experience, anyone who didn't blip was either traumatized or had no friends pre-blip, in which case I don't want to date them. Okay, well, he's being honest. People who blip went through similar experience as me, having to rebuild your life after being absent 5.5 years. This can also be traumatic, but it's a very different beast. A few months of chaos getting your social security number reinstated doesn't match up to a non-blipped experience. Non-blips that are my age now are like my little sister's age in a generation. I was one time lied to about something that happened during the blip on a first date, and it made me really paranoid. So now in general, I just avoid it by dating blips. So what's the verdict? I think I'm justified, but a few of my friends say it's closed-minded or asshole-ish. I do not think so. I think you're just being honest. I mean, you have a type. What else is there to say? Now we're going to get to my favorite Reddit post. I was told not to reveal authorship, and you will see why after I read this thread. This one is really funny. As far as blip experiences goes, this is one of the funny or awkward ones I have read. It is titled, Didn't Get a Job I Was Interviewing For Because of a Misunderstanding Involving the Blip. And I love his use of the word misunderstanding. So I was unfortunately one of those people who were blipped for 5 years. I disappeared while I was shaving my beard off. And of course, I was going through a bunch of different looks while shaving different parts of the beard off, for fun. Like goatee, Fu Manchu, mustache, etc. Etc. Because any guy who's had a beard and has shaved it off completely has done this. And we all know what the etc. is because it's just a weird, sick thing that some people do. They start shaving, they see how good they look in a Fu Manchu, and then, they look in just a regular mustache, and then maybe they go a little bit like this, and just for half a second do that and go, and then shave it off again. That's what this gentleman is talking about here. Okay. We continue. Anyway, so I disappear during this and come back and no longer have the razor in my hands. Walk out of the bathroom and the woman now living in my apartment screams. because there's a man in her apartment in only his boxers sporting a damn Führer mustache that I was only supposed to have for like 30 seconds. I ran out of there as fast as I could, trying to get a grasp on what was happening. Anyway, fast forward to now. My Blip UBI was about to run out, so I applied for some jobs and got an interview, and I show up, and guess who's interviewing me? I tried to explain what happened, but she doesn't believe me that that's a normal thing dudes do when they shave. Oh, boy. I feel for you, man. It is definitely not a normal thing dudes do when they shave, but it is a thing dudes do when they shave from time to time. That's all we have for tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for making it this far. Phil will be back next time. I'm Jerry Anthony. I'll see you.